So in this presentation we are going to go over the basics of constructing a graph. Now these are going to be simple graphs, and they're going to be graphs that you're going to be using throughout the school year in this class, but also in lots of other classes. You'll be using graphs in math, but graphs are prevalent all over. You're going to see them in sports, you're going to see them in polls, you're going to see them in the newspaper, online clearly. We don't use the newspaper much, but news, magazines, the news on TV. There's going to be a lot of graphs and data presented to you in different ways for the rest of your life. So it's really important that you understand why graphs are the way they are, and that helps to be able to do that. We need to be able to understand how to actually make a graph. So we're going to be creating a graph and kind of going over the basics here. Okay, so the first thing you need to do is when you have a set of data, you need to choose a graph. The kind of graph that you're going to use. Now there are lots of kind of graphs. We're going to go over the three basic main types of graphs. We're going to have line graphs. We're going to have, which are right up here. Okay, we're going to have bar graphs, and we're going to have pie graphs. Now you've probably seen all of these different kinds of graphs at different points. And they're used for different things. Line graphs, right up here, line graphs are used to show changes over a short period of time. So it changes in a particular thing over a short period of time, and they also show us, we can look at the same time and compare changes of different things over that same amount of time. Bar graphs, right here, bar graphs are also going to compare changes, but instead of a short period of time like line graphs, we're looking at long periods of time. So a bar graph is going to show us a longer period of time. Now pie graphs are percentages. Whenever you see percentages, you're really looking at pie graphs or pie charts. They compare parts of a whole to each other. So you could look at this graph and say that about 33% of whatever would be this green. So it's going to look at percentages. So the table, the data we're going to look at today looks like this, and this is showing us months and the amount of rainfall in inches in that month. Now this is not necessarily anywhere in particular, it's just some data. So we're going to use this data right here, and we're going to create a graph. Now knowing what we now know about line graphs, bar graphs, and pie graphs, what kind of graph should we use? So we're comparing over time, so that eliminates here. We're not doing percentages, we're not comparing a whole. So we are not going to be using the pie chart, pie graph. So are we going to be using a line graph or a bar graph? Now we're looking at a short period of time, a relatively short period of time, 1 year, which is not a long period of time. So we're going to be using the line graph. We're looking at a short period of time versus a long period of time. So we're going to be using a line graph when we are looking at this particular data. So now that we know what kind of graph we're going to use, we need to actually make the graph. And so there are several steps to doing, so let's walk through them. Now the first thing we need to do is we need to label the x and the y axis. Okay, the x-axis is right down here, x-axis. Okay, and then the y-axis goes down the side. It's not a very good y. So y goes down the side, and x goes this way. Okay. Now the x and y axis, in order to determine what we put on the x-axis and what we put on the y-axis, we need to know the difference between an independent variable and a dependent variable. Independent variable is always going to go on the x-axis. Independent variable, we're going to make IV independent variable, and that's going to go on the x-axis, and then our dependent variable is going to go down the y-axis. Now what is independent and dependent variable? Independent variables are the variables in an experiment or in a table that you're looking at, the data you're looking at, that the person doing the experiment has some sort of control over. So in our particular information, we have months of the year and we have the amount of rainfall. Now we're looking for the independent variable, the one that you have some control over. You have no control over how much rain comes out of the sky. That we have no control over that, but you can choose which month you collect data from. You can choose what year you want to collect the data from. You can determine, you can decide what temperature you're going to set a room at. You can determine how many people are going to do a certain thing. So there are things that you can control. Those are going to be your independent variable. So in our case, with our rainfall and the months, the one that you can actually control is the month. So months are going to go along the bottom, and then our dependent variable is going to depend on the independent variable. Dependent depends on the independent variable. So our dependent variable is going to be the one that changes according to the independent variable. So in our particular table we looked at, we had month and we had rainfall. The rainfall depends on which month it is. Some months had more rainfall than other, and it depended on which month it was. So our dependent variable is going to be the amount of rainfall, and we need to make sure we put in the unit there, which is inches. So we have our axes now labeled. That's the first thing we need to do. Now the next thing we need to do is to choose an appropriate scale. And what that means is we need to label all these little lines. We need to know where we're going to plot our points. So with the bottom here, it's normally pretty easy. It's maybe a temperature, it may be a month, a year. So that one's pretty easy. We can just put, if you look here, okay, we have our months, so we're going to put our months along the bottom. Okay, and then if we look at our table here again, we have a pretty good variation of numbers here. It looks like our smallest number is going to be 10, and our largest number is going to be 60. So we need our information on this side to start somewhere around 10 and end somewhere around 60. Now if this information here started at 50, we wouldn't want to start down at 0 or 10. We want to start around 50. We don't need a bunch of blank space at the bottom of our graph. So we're going to start right around 10 and we're going to end right around 60. Now I like to do one additional number on each side just to give us a little bit of breathing room. So the next thing we need to do is we have our numbers. We need to decide what scale are we using. Are we going to go by ones? Are we going to go 1, 2, 3, 4, 5? Are we going to go by 2s, 2, 4, 6, 3s, 5s, 10s, 15, 20, 100s? Since we're going from 10 to 60, we probably don't want to go by ones because that would be a lot of lines up the side. 2s, same thing, 3s. 5s, however, if you look at our numbers, they're all a variant of a 5. So I'm going to go by 5s. That feels like that would be the best number for me. So I'm going to start with 5 because that's just below our 10. And we're going to go all the way up to 1 past 60, 65. So we now have appropriate scale now. We have our months along the bottom, and we have our inches up the side, starting right around where we start our lowest number and ending right around our highest number. So that's our appropriate scale. So we now have our scale set up. So now that our scale is set up, we can actually graph the points. So we're going to look at our table here, and we're actually going to plot these points. I want to plot them in blue here. So January is 35. You want to try to make sure they're lined up pretty well. February is just 30. Okay, March is 20. April jumps all the way to 55. Now if you're doing this on paper and you're a little bit of a perfectionist, you may want to use a ruler. Or you can even use graph paper, which is really easy and convenient to use. So let's get this done here. We get June is 15, July is 10, August is 25, September is 35, October is 45, 50, and then 55. Now once you get all your points plotted, in this particular case we're doing a line graph. If you're doing a bar graph, of course you're going to just form bars above each of those. But we're doing a line graph, so we're going to draw a line to connect our dots. So I'll use a green line here to connect them. And once again, easier with a ruler or on paper than doing this on a computer. But it's going to give us at least a pretty basic understanding of what our graph should look like. So this is what the graph looks like. So we have for each month we can look at, and we have our points graph that match up, correspond with our table. Now we can look at this graph, and if somebody were to say about how many inches was the rainfall in September, you could look at here and say, okay, September's here. It looks like it was about 35 inches. So we have our points graphed. Now you may look at this and be like, okay, we're done. but we're actually missing one thing. There's one really important thing that we need to make sure that we finish, and that is adding an actual title to our graph. Now, titles are important, because if not, you have no idea what this graph is showing you. You could say, okay, well, it's months of rainfall, but where is it? Why is it significant? We need to understand what this graph is. So let's say that this is in a city that's known as Charleston. Not any particular city, but we'll just make up a city. So we're going to put a graph up there at the top, and our graph is going to say something along the lines of amount of rainfall in inches in Charleston for each month of the year. So we're going to add that as our title right up here along the top. We'll add our title, okay, something like this, rainfall inches per month, and then we're going to add in something along the lines of in Charleston, or something in whatever city or country, or we could say this is in Namibia or wherever it is. So with that done, we now have our tables done. Our graph is done. We've taken that table we saw originally and we've made it into a picture form, a pictorial representation of what that table is. And we can now look at this and we can determine approximately how much rainfall is happening in each month in Namibia or wherever it's going to be. So we're going to be using this skill a lot, graphing in general. A lot of them will be line graphs, but we'll be also using pie graphs and bar graphs. But as long as you understand the basics here, it's going to make the rest of the year really easy. So if you need to go back and read this, watch this again, do it again. You can skip through and look at the parts you didn't quite understand. But make sure that you understand the main concepts that we have here.